And in that he says, he, that is the prince, needs must always hurt those whose new prince he becomes, and hurt them with men at arms, and with infinite other injuries that the new acquisition drags with it. Okay? And his reasoning is just very typical. This is the way Machiavelli thinks. Okay? If you come into a new territory and you don't do these things, if you're not harsh with people and harsh very quickly, what will happen is that they will come to take you for granted and even treat you with contempt because you have not asserted yourself and you haven't gained their respect. Okay? So he says, for instance, for those who didn't want you, they're already unhappy, and if you don't treat them very forcefully, they will be looking for an opportunity to overthrow you and bring the old regime back in. Okay? But he says, even those who wanted you and helped you to come in, if you had any allies in this city or country, okay, they also will quickly get tired of you and look for ways to overthrow you if you don't do one of two things. If you give them what they want, okay, they will be appeased for a while, but they'll always want more and more and more and more. So like if you give them some lands and territories and you give them some money and say, thank you for helping me, give them titles, don't think that's going to be the end of it, because human beings always want more. Okay? And so they will just keep after you, and they will continue to hold you in a position of subordination. Okay? We're talking about the lords and the barons, the people in society that are powerful, wealthy, in that era, had their own arms, their own men working for them. Okay? So if you give them things, these people, if you elevate them, they're going to treat you with contempt, and they're simply going to want more. So he says you need to level society. Okay? Those who have helped you are probably more of a worry to you than anybody else because they expect something from you, and they expect to share in your power. So you have to make it clear right away that you will not do that, and that you're in charge. And so he actually recommends, without reason, okay, without justification, finding those people that you want to, for whatever reason, make an example of. Okay? Now, in a way, that's exactly what happened to Machiavelli with the de Medici. Okay? He worked for the Republican government, but they really didn't have any evidence that he had directly conspired to bring in a different form of government, and yet it really didn't matter. They imprisoned him, tortured him, and threw him into exile. Okay? And it worked for them. Okay? They did this to many people, and the result was they consolidated their power and they were unchallenged. All right? So, Machiavelli, you can see right away, is not one to think in terms of justice and injustice like Socrates did. This is not advice Socrates or Plato would give. Okay? Because first, for them, the leader has to know what justice is, and then he has to rule according to it in order to be a good leader. And here we have Machiavelli saying, if you want to hang on to power, which is the first thing, okay, if you don't have power, you can't do anything else. You have to do these things. If you don't, here's what's going to happen to you. You're going to be overthrown, or you're going to be taken advantage of by the people around you. Okay? So, he warns the prince that if he temporizes, okay, if he's not 100% in his declaration of what he wants and what he will do and what will happen to you if you disagree with him, then he will send the signal that he is weak, and pretty soon his enemies will overthrow him. And remember, he says, the old ruler always looks good by comparison. Whenever somebody new comes in, they can never please people, and people will hearken back to the old ruler, even if the old ruler was harsh. Okay? So they'll try to bring back the old ruler or the old power. Okay? He says those who have lost a state and conquered it again, learn this and never make the same mistake twice. Okay? They become ruthless because they have to be. So you can see this is the opposite of the concern for justice, because the prince is rounding up people and punishing them without regard for what they have done. Even to him, I mean personally, you might think it's wrong to round up people just because they disagree with you, but we're not even talking about that. Okay? We're talking about random selection in a way. It's sort of like if the government took a phone book, flipped it open, and found 10 names and arrested them. Okay? So this is the opposite of justice, but Machiavelli says it's very effective and also very necessary. Okay? And that's what the realist, the Machiavellian thinker falls back on, is this necessity. Okay? Politics introduces this absolute necessity that if we're going to get anything done, we have to pay attention to it and we have to abide by it. Okay? So this is some advice that gets Machiavelli that reputation that you learned about in the video, Machiavellianism. Why we use that term to describe people who are ruthless or who don't care about moral principles.
I was going to ask you of that, even like in Spanish or other languages, I guess it's the same. You always use that term to say like you're evil or you're going to do something like a Machiavelli plan.
Machiavelli.
Plan, like you're planning something bad. Why is that related to
Machiavelli?
Yeah.
Because of his advice. I mean, you're going to learn that he advises the most unscrupulous behavior. And it really runs counter to morality. And he comes from the 16th century, okay, during the time that Shakespeare wrote. And Shakespeare actually used that word, Machiavelli, and I think he was the first to use Machiavel as a description of a person who was ruthless and immoral. Okay? And from there, that term then took root. And so it started in Europe, all the European countries. Shakespeare being a text, that many, many people know, picked up on that word, and that's how it comes into our language. Yeah. A lot of words come into our language, or in the way that we use them through Shakespeare. So, yes, what I want to do is I want to describe ways in which people look at Machiavelli, first of all. And one way is that he is a teacher of immorality and therefore to be avoided, and that political thought that veers off on this path is bad because it encourages bad behavior, and you get what you encourage. Okay? Another example of this type of advice that he gives very early on in your readings, you read chapters 1 through 5 for this week, involves how you maintain your territories once you take them. And he gives this advice in The Prince, but he also gives it in the Discourses, because the Discourses discusses both the taking and the maintaining of republics. Well, when you found a republic, lo and behold, a lot of times Machiavelli says you have to do the same sort of things that you do with a principality. And so he says, first of all, it's better to live there yourself or to have your people live there and colonize it than to simply do what the Greeks often did and tax the people there but let them rule themselves. If you want to keep a territory, it has to be truly yours. And not just taxes and maybe some sort of quasi-representation, but you have to attempt to change their culture. So Machiavelli is the first to understand how important culture is to identity. And in his view, especially in the Discourses, he goes at great lengths to talk about change their language, change their religion, okay? Because if you change their language and their religion, he says, then they can't even think the way they did before, and then they're absolutely yours, okay? And they cannot be changed back. So that takes colonization to a whole new level. He does advise placing colonies in this book, and that means, taking your own people, making them live there, and in that way you change the culture. And you put people in power there who have a strong interest in maintaining that power. And since they live there, they know exactly what's going on, and no disobedience or insubordination can occur without you knowing about it. Okay? He says, don't make anyone else too powerful. Okay? Machiavelli was not a big believer in elevating a certain class of people. And in his day, aristocracy was the way society ran. But Machiavelli could see the dangers of having this set class of people that thought that they were privileged and empowered. And so Machiavelli says, those who are at that high level you need to bring down, either by taking away their property or by taking away their privileges, and maybe bring some people who are lowly up. But basically, everybody needs to be dependent upon the power of the prince. The less independent power that people have, the better. Okay? he advises, and we'll see this throughout this book, if you get the weak many on your side, this is better because they have no power to start with. You can gain their favor very easily by giving them things that they don't have typically right now, like security and food, okay? Providing them with an environment where they can actually make enough money to feed their families. Very, very simple things that they want that they're often deprived of by the predatory nobles of their day, as well as by the bandits. So Machiavelli says, eliminate crime. That'll benefit people. But the weak can be much stronger allies because they don't have that independent base of power. Okay? Everything they get, they know they get from the prince, so then they become the prince's best friend. So you see, even when Machiavelli starts to sound a bit democratic or a bit like a friend of the people, in a way he brings everything back to the interest of the government, in this case the prince. And he's simply saying that in order to be powerful, this is the better way. Okay? This is where Machiavelli says, by the way, to stop resistance before it starts. He says on page 11, he likens this is one of his few metaphors. He's not as big on metaphors or allegories as Plato, but he gives one here, and he does in several other spots. He says on page 11 near the top, it is necessary not only to pay attention to immediate crises, but to foresee those that will come, and to make every effort to prevent them. For if you see them coming well in advance, you can easily take the appropriate action to remedy them. But if you wait until they are right on top of you, then the prescription will no longer take effect because the disease is too far advanced. In this matter it is, as doctors say, of consumption. In the beginning, the disease is easy to cure, difficult to diagnose. But after a while, if it has not been diagnosed and treated early, it becomes easy to diagnose and hard to cure. Okay? So he's likening disorder within a territory to the disease of something like pneumonia. Okay? If you wait until you know exactly where the disorder comes from, who the people are who are rebellious against you, who are plotting, it's too late to do much about it. That has gone so far that even if you try to get rid of some of them, there'll be more. Okay? We know that's true, right? The Iranian government is having that problem right now. And if we nip it in the bud, which means to cure the disease early, that means, though, that we have to select targets that may or may not have anything to do with any disobedience or wrongdoing, okay? Before we know the disease. So there's where he gives that advice. All right, so far we've looked at examples that critics of Machiavelli would use to call his teaching dangerous. They say that politics is prone to abuse anyway. And here we have a thinker who very openly and boldly accepts all that and teaches leaders how to hold power, win and hold power by force and also by fraud, which means deception, which we'll talk a lot about. Okay? And these are things that Plato knew, for instance, Socrates, Plato, they knew that a lot of leaders did this. We saw that in the Gorgias. The Socrates was very well aware that leaders used rhetoric in that case to lie to people sometimes. But they felt that it was necessary for intellectuals to try to argue against that, to try to make that behavior better. Okay? Whereas here we have Machiavelli just delving right into it, jumping right in. Okay? And because of that, they say he contributes to the political problem. That argument for necessity, which they would argue is false, okay? That there is no necessity to always conform to the lowest common denominator, okay? That argument of necessity is infectious in a bad way. And it justifies bad behavior and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, there are other ways to look at Machiavelli. Okay, and we're going to look at all three. And as we go through the text, I want you to keep in mind these different ways of looking at what he's doing. Because not everybody is a critic that simply says, well, that's a dangerous thing to say. You shouldn't say it because that brings about the problem that you have. Another way of looking at what Machiavelli is doing is that he is, in effect, a sort of political scientist or journalist of some sort who is simply for, maybe not the first time, but very significantly anyway, giving us the raw data of politics, okay? By showing us exactly the way things really work. And in doing that, he's sort of doing what Gorgias says he's doing, giving information that people can use however they want. So some people look at Machiavelli as reporting the truth about political power, rather objectively. And there are many places in this book where you can see that kind of advice, or where you can see evidence that Machiavelli's attitude is this way. One way in which this can be seen is that oftentimes Machiavelli says, if you want to do this, then here's these examples of other people who've done it and succeeded. Okay? In other words, as a leader, I guess you could choose not to do that, okay? But if you do want to do that, then here, and he always gives plenty of examples. And he'll give examples about people who've tried and failed to do this, whatever it is, conquering new territory, and people who have succeeded. And so in that way, he'll tell you what works, but is he necessarily telling you to do it? Or that that is the best thing to do? Not necessarily. And in any case, his advice may seem rather useful to us, even if we disagree with this type of leadership, because it helps us to understand how at least some leaders behave. Okay? So it's an education even to those people who would be critics of this approach to politics. Okay? One place in the text, in the part that you've read so far, where people draw as evidence of this objectivity, which is only a partial, there's other examples as we move through the text that might be better. But on page 13, up at the first full paragraph, Machiavelli says, it is perfectly natural and normal to want to acquire new territory. And whenever men do what will succeed towards this end, they will be praised, or at least not condemned. But when they are not in a position to make gains and try nevertheless, then they are making a mistake and deserve condemnation. Okay? Well, it's kind of the translation doesn't help here. But the way that he couches these words in the beginning, where he says, whenever men do what will succeed, they will be praised. Okay? You could read that as simply an objective statement. There he's not saying men should do whatever will succeed regardless. Okay? But he is stating a fact about human nature and how human beings tend to look at their government. Okay? And to him, people are very, in a way, superficial. The most people, the mass of people, are fairly superficial. And we see him stating this over and over again. They don't look into the heart of the matter. They don't look into how you do things, as long as what you do is successful and benefits them. So let's say that you fight a war and you win it rather effectively. The people are not going to ask any questions about, well, how did you fight that war? What methods did you use? What even was the purpose of it? Okay? But they will ask those questions if you don't succeed. Okay? And then they will begin to find blame and pick it apart and so forth. So this is could be seen as just a statement, a truism about human nature. People praise what is successful and do not examine it very well. People examine what fails. Okay? It's an interesting observation, and one that I probably would have to agree with myself. It seems like an aspect of, we're all too happy to just go along for the ride if things are working fine. Okay? And most people at Machiavelli's time were far less informed than we are, so for all they knew, things were working fine as long as they were getting enough food to eat, felt secure, had a roof over their head. Okay? So these are the things Machiavelli says people care about. And if you give those things, they're not going to really care about how you do it, whether you've lied, whether you've used some unjust practice, killed a few innocent people, as long as it's not them. Okay? Hate to depress you too much here, but this is the way Machiavelli looked at the world. Okay? Sometimes Machiavelli is called the first political scientist or first social scientist. Not in the modern sense, though. I mean, he didn't crunch numbers or anything like that, but he looks at the world, at least partly you could say, by looking at the data. And by saying, okay, I'm not going to talk about what you should or shouldn't do. I'm going to talk about what is actually done and analyze it from that perspective. And then finally, some observers emphasize Machiavelli's patriotism, and we will see this. Now, in the first 5 chapters, you don't see much evidence of this, okay? So from those first 5 chapters, you wouldn't know Machiavelli cared that much about the Italians and their situation. But as you move towards the middle and then the end of the book, he starts to emphasize this issue more and more. That he thinks that the Italians, as a people, are being overburdened by meddlesome powers from outside because they're not unified. Okay? And sometimes that meddlesome power is inside too, the church. It meddles, it makes alliances, it breaks them, it intrigues, but it can't ultimately accomplish unification. But also the states such as Spain and Germany, and some of these, not Germany so much, but Spain and France, that in his day were threatening because they had achieved more cohesion. Okay? And so he begins to argue that the Italians need to be unified, and perhaps he's arguing this to Lorenzo because at some point he thought Lorenzo might be capable of doing this. He says that there needs to be a leader who can convince people to join him and not oppose him and bring these forces together.
Lorenzo was the one that he wrote the letter to, but Giuliano was Lorenzo's brother, I guess.
Right.
And what
The Pope's brother at that time. Yeah. The introduction deals with who Machiavelli might have written this book to first, and there's speculation about that. So Giuliano was somebody who he may have originally intended, but we don't have absolute proof for that. Okay? The only thing we have absolute proof for, because he did this, was that he dedicated to Lorenzo. But scholars have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what might have been in Machiavelli's mind and who would be best, to actually accomplish this. Giuliano might have been because of his connection to the
So
church.
the prince, or the one that was going to rule was Lorenzo in this case in Florence.
Yeah, Lorenzo was the Prince of Florence at this time. And he was actually of the family that had thrown Machiavelli out after imprisoning and torturing him. So he was writing this book, or dedicating this book, to a person who was directly responsible for his punishment, but who was in charge and whom he needed to get back in the good graces of. Yeah. Okay? So anyway, we will look at all 3 of these interpretations. And one of the reasons I like to do that in this particular unit is to give you an idea, just a little idea, of a bigger issue, which is that scholars disagree about what authors mean. Okay? Now, for some of you, this is probably old news, but not for everybody. Okay? And they can sometimes disagree so profoundly that they have a thinker saying opposite things. Okay? So if you just read one scholar on Machiavelli and think that you're getting Machiavelli, you're not. Okay? Because there's definite schools of thought about what Machiavelli was all about, and they very much disagree. So they emphasize this or that part of the argument. Some of them take the Prince as a whole without looking at the discourses and what is said there. Some look at the Prince and discourses as opposite. Some look at them as very, very much of a unified whole. So I want to give you some idea about that. And this is why also I ask you to read the original work instead of interpretations, because you need to learn how to think about the text for yourself. Okay? And part of the reason why that's valuable is because you can't get the gospel truth from an analyst. Okay? And what you could do is, if you had the time, read rather broadly, and then you'd get a pretty good picture of the overall, but you still wouldn't have as good a picture as if you read the original yourself. So there are many ways of looking at a text like this. And that's good. Some people find it aggravating. Some people find it very freeing. Okay? But scholars wrangle a lot about this. Okay, well, I just want to talk a little bit about the two letters before we end for this week. We have this letter to his friend Francesco. Okay? And I hope you all had that in your book. If you didn't, like I said, you probably can find this one online somewhere. But we find that Machiavelli is writing this out in the countryside, having been exiled. Francesco is still in Florence, and Machiavelli sees him as having connections. Okay? Connections to the church, but more importantly, connections to the Medicis. Okay? And he fancies him a friend. Now, one thing we know is that Francesco didn't do anything for Machiavelli, so he may have considered him more of a friend than he was. Okay? But you can see from this letter how desperate Machiavelli feels by how he depicts himself. Okay? And first of all, he makes these general statements, which really do reflect his basic opinion about things. Fortune wants to control everything, but we should not let her. Okay, so he starts out on a philosophical note. And that is so characteristic of Machiavelli. I mean, the great thing about Machiavelli is he doesn't want to leave anything to fate. He believes that human beings have within their power to greatly change their situation. Okay?
Do they say like fortune and like the Catholic God as like one and the same?
Machiavelli kind of uses them differently in a way, but I'm not sure how serious he is about the Catholic God. And I think that's why he and other Renaissance thinkers start to use these other terms more as a substitute for it. He does say God and fortune, so in that sense he distinguishes between the two. But when he's talking about those things, he seems to really be talking about not so much a theological concept as what life gives us. Okay? So in fact, fortune is later on in the book identified with that Roman goddess of fortune, or Fortuna. And that's something that Renaissance thinkers did a lot. They delved back into the ancient Roman and Greek mythology, and they almost interspersed their writings with both Christian and non-Christian sources of authority for things like, what makes the world work, and what governs human beings' fates, and so forth. So that's a good question, and it's problematic because we're not sure exactly whether Machiavelli was even a believer or not. Many people thought he wasn't because he seemed to think of religion in such a utilitarian fashion. Okay? So if I had to guess, if I was giving you my opinion, I would say probably he's not thinking of the Christian God, but rather he's using it in terms of the forces of the world, which throw things at us. And that seems to be how he uses it later. Life gives us certain things, and lots of times human beings are not really capable of handling that. They've been going along one way, and when something hits them, a crisis or a disaster of some kind, they're just blown away by it, and they don't know what to do. Now, Machiavelli had this crisis in his life, where he's accused of crimes he may not have done. And in any case, he's tortured, and he's thrown out of any position, okay, and into relative obscurity and poverty, okay. And what he's saying here is that just because this has happened to me doesn't mean I'm giving up, but rather there's always a way that you can turn your fortune around, okay, or you could see good fortune within bad fortune. And in a way, writing these books is part of that for him. Instead of sitting in the countryside being depressed, when he was not able to do what he really loved to do, he turned to what he would do second, okay, which he didn't have time for before, and writing these books, which turned out to be the best thing he ever did. So we need to, actually, he says, use fortune, okay? Take what most people think of as an insurmountable obstacle and turn it into something that can work for us. this difficult thing for people to do. He says, since fortune wants to control everything, she evidently wants to be left a free hand. Meanwhile, we should keep our own counsel and not get in her way and wait until she allows human beings to have a say in the course of events. That will be the time for you to work harder and keep a closer eye on events, and for me to leave my country house and say, here I am. Of course, that didn't happen that way, okay? But there's always an opportunity, and that paragraph shows it. And as he moves through the text, you see it more and more, okay? You think that things are going badly, but you've got to look for that opportunity. And those who continuously look for it or find a way to spin bad fortune into good fortune, those are the winners. In today's economy, we see this, the people who have managed to make a profit in a recession are people who thought about what do people need, and what will give them a good value when they don't have much money. And there are people making money and rising up during this time economically. So other folks have a hard time coping, and that's not necessarily condemnation. It's just a fact of life that Machiavelli points out. Some folks are better able to just cling and stubbornly look for that opportunity and take chances, which he's very big on. Okay? So Machiavelli spent some time getting Francesco to feel sorry for him, in a way, okay, by describing his life. Now you have to remember, Machiavelli is used to the urban life, where he never gets dirty, and where he has friends constantly, and he goes out and has coffee or drinks every day with his friends, and has great conversations, and feels as though he's extremely connected, okay? And now he's out in the countryside, and for him this is far from ideal, let's say, okay? So he says, first I get up and I go and I check on the woodcutters, and they're the ones who are actually making the money for Machiavelli, okay? He's not doing it himself, but he's hired men to come in and take down the wood. And he sells it, and that's how he's making money. So he takes some time to read at a spring on his property, and it's interesting what he reads. He says at the bottom of page 2, when I leave the wood, I go to a spring, and from there I check my bird nets. I carry a book with me, Dante or Petrarch, or one of the minor poets, maybe Tibullus or Ovid, or someone like that. I read about their infatuations and their love affairs, reminisce about my own, and enjoy my reveries for a while. Then I set out on the road to the inn. So to him, these works, I'm reading Dante again right now, and it's a great work. And Ovid is a writer I've read. We tend to think of them as rather weighty and worth reading these days. And here we have Machiavelli, though, saying that they're kind of mild entertainment, what he would call romantic reading. And they are, in a way. I mean, they're very figurative books, like Dante describes hell, and he describes it in great detail with all the layers, and Virgil is taking him through hell, and then he goes on up to heaven. Well, that's very interesting, but in Machiavelli's view, it's entertainment. It doesn't teach him or anybody else much that's important about politics, about life, okay? So that's an interesting observation, that he entertains himself. And then he goes to the inn, and there he meets up with country folks, okay? And the country folks are people he spends time with, but whom he doesn't really respect. He calls them bumpkins at one point. But yet they're the only folks that are there, okay? And he has a couple of beers with them, we can imagine. He gossips with them about all the local gossip. He plays cards or dice with them, games. And he whiles away a lot of hours at the bar, basically, okay? Then he eats lunch with his family. Then he's back to the inn, okay? And so he whiles away his day. But in the evening, he says, after all of this, he comes back home, and he is finally at peace with himself, okay? Page 3 is where he refers to his fellows as bumpkins. In the company of these bumpkins, I keep my brain from turning moldy and put up with the hostility fate has shown me. And then the next paragraph says, when evening comes, I go back home, go to my study, and on the threshold I take off my work clothes covered in mud and filth, and put on the clothes of an ambassador. Decently dressed, I enter the ancient courts of rulers who have long since died. There I am warmly welcomed, and I feed on the only food I find nourishing and was born to savor. I'm not ashamed to talk to them and to ask them to explain their actions, and they out of kindness answer me. I'm not afraid of poverty or frightened of death. I live entirely through them. What's he talking about?
Study of ancient texts.
Exactly. He's reading the ancient histories. He's reading philosophy. Yeah.
What is your comparison with Republican friends? Like just Jenny or him, I don't know. Like just that he's going and gossiping with like the little people, you know, but I don't know if those are Republican.
Those are not his Republican friends. His Republican friends would have been the people in Florence before the demise of the Republic that he associated with. These people are just ordinary folks that don't really care much about politics. Okay? All right, well, we'll see you Wednesday. No class on Monday.